The radar screen glowed green in the darkness of my cockpit, showing nothing but empty sky over the Pacific. It was August 12, 1945, 3 days after the Nagasaki bombing, and I was Captain Jack Morrison, pilot of a P-61 Black Widow night fighter operating from Iwo Jima. The war was effectively over, but Japanese forces hadn't surrendered yet, and our orders were to maintain combat air patrols until official word came down. "Contact," my radar operator, Lieutenant Dave Anderson, said suddenly. "Bearing 320, range 40 miles, altitude 20,000 feet. Multiple targets. Looks like a formation of at least 8 aircraft." "Japanese?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. We were the only Allied aircraft operating in this sector at night, and radar contacts at that altitude meant military aircraft, not civilian transport. "Has to be. They're heading northeast. Speed about 200 knots. Flight profile suggests bombers, possibly Mitsubishi G4Ms. Betty bombers. Large twin-engine aircraft that the Japanese used for bombing and torpedo attacks. But what were 8 Betty bombers doing flying northeast at night, 3 days after Nagasaki? The war was lost. Everyone knew it. What target could possibly justify a bombing mission now? "Intercept course," I ordered. "Let's see what they're up to." The P-61 Black Widow was a formidable aircraft, a large twin-engine night fighter, equipped with radar, heavy armament, and the ability to operate in conditions where other fighters were useless. We'd been conducting night patrols for months, intercepting Japanese aircraft that tried to use darkness as cover for bombing raids or reconnaissance missions. But this contact felt different. The formation was too tight, too organized for a desperate last-gasp attack. These aircraft were flying with purpose, as if they had a specific mission that justified the risk, despite Japan being on the verge of surrender. We closed on the formation at 30,000 feet, positioning ourselves above and behind them. Through the darkness, I could make out the distinctive silhouettes of G4M Betty bombers, 8 of them flying in a tight V formation, maintaining strict radio silence. "They haven't seen us," Anderson said. "No evasive maneuvers, no change in course. They're just flying straight. Let's get a visual before we engage. Something about this doesn't feel right." I descended to 22,000 feet, positioning the Black Widow about 2 miles behind the formation, where I could observe without being detected. What I saw through my night vision equipment was puzzling. The bombers were heavily loaded, flying low and slow for aircraft at this altitude, suggesting significant weight, but they weren't configured for a bombing mission. The bomb bay doors were closed, and the aircraft showed no external ordnance. They were carrying something internal, something heavy enough to affect their flight characteristics. "Dave, you seeing this? They're loaded with something, but it's not bombs." "I see it. Heavy cargo, internal bay configuration. Could be supplies. Evacuating personnel or equipment? At night in formation, 3 days after Nagasaki. That doesn't make sense." I maintained position behind the formation for another 10 minutes, trying to understand what I was witnessing. The bombers continued northeast, showing no awareness of our presence. Their course was taking them away from any remaining Japanese-held territory, away from the home islands toward empty ocean. More precisely, they were heading toward the general area of the Bonin Islands and beyond, remote Pacific islands that Japan still controlled but had little strategic value at this stage of the war. Why would valuable aircraft be sent to such a remote location with precious cargo when Japan was about to surrender? Then my combat instincts overrode my curiosity. Whatever these aircraft were doing, they were enemy combatants operating in a war zone. My orders were clear: intercept and destroy enemy aircraft. The war wasn't officially over until Japan surrendered, and until that moment, every enemy aircraft was a potential threat. "Arm weapons," I told Anderson. "We're engaging." The P-61 carried 4 20mm cannons in the belly and 4 50 caliber machine guns in a dorsal turret. Against unarmored bombers, the firepower was devastating. I positioned for an attack run from above and behind, the classic fighter approach that gave the target minimal warning. I opened fire at 800 yards, the 20mm cannons sending streams of tracers into the trailing bomber. The rounds ripped through the fuselage and wing, and the Betty immediately caught fire. But something unusual happened. The aircraft seemed to burn with an intensity and color that wasn't normal for aviation fuel fires. The flames had a strange greenish tint, mixed with the usual orange, and the bomber fell away from the formation trailing smoke that looked oddly thick and dark. The formation scattered. The remaining 7 bombers broke in different directions, abandoning their tight V pattern and attempting evasive maneuvers. But Betty bombers were slow and ungainly, easy targets for a fighter designed specifically for night interception. I pursued the second bomber, closing to 600 yards before firing again. More hits, more flames, and again that strange intensity to the fire. This bomber didn't just burn, it seemed to consume itself with unusual ferocity. The aircraft broke apart in mid-air, pieces tumbling toward the ocean below. The crew never had a chance to bail out. "Jack, did you see that?" Anderson's voice was tense. "Those fires aren't normal. Something about the way those bombers are burning, it's not right." I noticed. Whatever they're carrying, it's highly flammable or reactive. "Stay alert. Contact 3 bearing 045, Anderson called out, tracking another target. I wheeled the Black Widow into a tight turn, pursuing a Betty that was attempting to dive away from the engagement. The bomber was slow, too slow, struggling with whatever heavy cargo it carried. I could see the pilot attempting desperate maneuvers, steep banks, altitude changes, but the aircraft responded sluggishly, weighed down by its mysterious cargo. I closed quickly and fired a burst that shattered the cockpit and left engine. The bomber went into an uncontrolled dive, and as it fell, I saw something that would haunt me for years. The bomb bay doors opened, whether intentionally or from structural damage I couldn't tell, and objects fell from the aircraft. In the moonlight I could see they were metal containers, cylindrical shapes that tumbled separately from the dying bomber. "Did you see that?" I asked Anderson. "They're jettisoning cargo." I saw it. Those looked like sealed containers, maybe 50-gallon drums. Why would they jettison cargo during combat? Maybe trying to lighten the load, gain maneuverability, or maybe... I didn't finish the thought, but it was disturbing. Maybe they were trying to prevent us from capturing whatever those containers held. Over the next 20 minutes, I systematically hunted down and destroyed 5 more Betty bombers. Each engagement was similar. The heavily loaded aircraft couldn't maneuver effectively, couldn't escape, couldn't fight back with any effectiveness. Several more jettisoned their cargo as they went down, metal containers falling into the dark Pacific. The third bomber I engaged actually tried to fight back in an unusual way. As I approached for the attack run, the bomber's side hatches opened, and crew members began throwing objects out, not to jettison weight, but seemingly trying to create a debris field that I might collide with. I saw boxes, containers, and loose equipment tumbling from the aircraft. It was a desperate, futile gesture that didn't prevent me from destroying the bomber, but it demonstrated how determined they were to dispose of their cargo. By the time I broke off the engagement due to low fuel, 7 of the 8 bombers were confirmed destroyed. 1 had escaped into cloud cover and disappeared from radar. 7 aircraft, probably 70 crew members, all dead, and an unknown number of mysterious containers scattered across miles of Pacific Ocean. "Good shooting," Anderson said as we turned back toward Iwo Jima. 7 confirmed kills in 1 engagement. That's got to be some kind of record for night fighters. "Yeah," I replied, but I felt uneasy rather than triumphant. Something about the engagement bothered me. The bombers hadn't been on a bombing mission. They'd been transporting something important enough to risk 8 valuable aircraft in the final days of a lost war. Something so sensitive that crews had tried desperately to jettison it rather than let it be captured. We landed at Iwo Jima at 0240 hours and filed our combat report. 7 Betty bombers destroyed, 1 escaped, probable cargo aircraft based on flight characteristics. I included details about the unusual fire characteristics and the jettisoned containers, but at the time I didn't understand their significance. The intelligence officer who debriefed us was more interested than usual, particularly when I mentioned the containers. "Cargo aircraft? What makes you say that?" "They were heavy, flying slow, struggling to maneuver, not configured for bombing. Bay doors closed, no external ordnance. They were carrying something internal, something that affected their performance, and several aircraft jettisoned containers during the engagement, metal drums or cylinders that fell separately from the aircraft wreckage. Did you see markings on these containers?" "Not at night from combat distance. They were just cylindrical shapes, maybe 3 or 4 feet long, falling from the aircraft. Looked like sealed drums of some kind." "And the fire characteristics you mentioned, unusual how?" "Greenish tint to the flames, unusually intense burning, not like normal aviation fuel fires, and the smoke was thick, darker than usual." The intelligence officer made extensive notes, asked several more questions about exact positions, times, and distances, then dismissed us. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another combat engagement in the closing days of the war. Japan surrendered 3 days later, on August 15, 1945. The war was officially over, but the story of what happened that night over the Pacific was just beginning. In the weeks following the surrender, as Allied forces occupied Japan and began processing captured documents, intelligence officers discovered something disturbing. On August 12, 1945, the same night I'd intercepted that formation, the Japanese military had initiated Operation Cherry Blossom, an emergency evacuation plan to move critical assets out of Japan before the surrender. The 8 Betty bombers I'd engaged weren't random cargo flights. They were part of a larger operation to evacuate valuable materials and personnel to secure locations before Allied occupation made such movements impossible. According to captured documents, the formation I'd intercepted was designated Cherry Blossom Flight 7, tasked with transporting what Japanese records described only as special research materials to an undisclosed location. What those special research materials were remained classified for decades. Even the Japanese government never provided clear answers. Official records were vague, contradictory, or simply missing. But piecing together fragmentary evidence from various sources, intelligence analysts developed a disturbing theory about what I'd destroyed that night. Japan had been conducting advanced weapons research throughout the war, chemical weapons, biological agents, and according to some reports, preliminary nuclear research under what was called the NIGO project. Most of this research was centered in facilities in northern Japan and Manchuria, but as the war situation deteriorated, the decision was made to evacuate critical materials and research data before they could be captured by Allied forces. Flight 7, according to the fragmentary records, had been loaded with research materials from a facility near Osaka, documents, samples, possibly even equipment related to weapons programs that Japan wanted to keep secret from the Allies. The intended destination was never clearly documented, but intelligence analysts believed the aircraft were heading toward remote Japanese-held islands where the materials could be hidden or destroyed before Allied forces arrived. I'd intercepted them before they could complete their mission. 7 aircraft destroyed, their cargo lost in the Pacific, some in the aircraft wreckage, some deliberately jettisoned by desperate crews trying to prevent capture. The 8th aircraft escaped, but its ultimate fate remained unknown. The implications were staggering. If the cargo had included biological or chemical weapons materials, I'd potentially prevented those weapons from being hidden or falling into unknown hands. If it included nuclear research data, as some analysts suspected, I'd eliminated a potential source of proliferation that could have complicated post-war arms control efforts. But none of this was confirmed. The Japanese government maintained that Flight 7 had been a routine evacuation of administrative materials, nothing more significant than documents and personal effects of military personnel. They denied that any special weapons materials had been aboard the aircraft, denied that the mission had any strategic significance, and refused to provide detailed manifests of what had been loaded onto those bombers. The controversy intensified when, in 1947, U.S. Navy ships conducting surveys in the area where I'd shot down the bombers discovered wreckage on the ocean floor. Divers examined one partially intact fuselage and found sealed containers marked with Japanese military symbols, but the containers had been breached by the crash and subsequent time in salt water. Whatever they'd contained was gone, degraded, or washed away. Analysis of residue from the containers was inconclusive. Some tests suggested the presence of organic compounds that might indicate biological materials, but contamination from marine life made definitive identification impossible. Other wreckage showed signs of lead shielding, which could suggest radioactive materials, but again the evidence was ambiguous. The greenish tint to the flames I'd observed could have indicated the presence of copper compounds, phosphorus, or various chemical agents, none of which led to definitive conclusions about the cargo's nature. I was called to testify at a classified hearing in 1948 about the engagement. Intelligence officers wanted every detail I could remember, the exact position of the intercept, the flight characteristics of the bombers, any visual observations about the cargo, the behavior of the crews, and particularly detailed questions about the containers I'd seen jettisoned. "Can you describe these containers more specifically?" one officer asked, showing me drawings of various Japanese military storage containers. I studied the drawings carefully. "Similar to this one," I said, pointing to a design showing a cylindrical drum with reinforced ends and what looked like sealed closures. maybe 3 to 4 feet long, diameter around 18 inches. They fell cleanly, rotating slowly, definitely heavier than empty containers would be. How many containers did you observe being jettisoned? Hard to say exactly. At least a dozen, maybe 20 total, across multiple aircraft. They were dropping them as they went down, like they were trying to scatter them across as wide an area as possible. That's significant, another officer said, making notes. Deliberate scattering suggests they wanted to make recovery difficult, possibly impossible. If they were just trying to lighten the aircraft, they'd dump everything at once. Did any of the aircraft attempt to jettison cargo during the engagement? The first officer asked. Not that I observed during the early part of the engagement. The jettisoning only started after I'd already damaged the aircraft, and it was clear they were going down. It seemed like a last resort. If they couldn't complete their mission, they'd at least prevent us from capturing the cargo intact. In your professional opinion, were these aircraft on a combat mission or a transport mission? Transport, definitely. Everything about their configuration, flight profile, and behavior indicated they were carrying cargo, not conducting combat operations. They weren't attacking anything, weren't maneuvering toward any target. They were just transporting something from point A to point B, and they were willing to die to prevent that cargo from being captured. That suggests it was extremely valuable or sensitive. The hearing concluded without any public release of findings. I was told that my testimony was classified and that I shouldn't discuss the engagement beyond what was already in my official combat report. The incident was buried in classified files, and I returned to civilian life trying to forget about the night I'd shot down 7 Japanese bombers carrying unknown cargo, but the story wouldn't stay buried. In the 1950s and 60s, as Cold War paranoia about nuclear proliferation and biological weapons intensified, intelligence agencies revisited Operation Cherry Blossom and Flight 7. Declassified documents reveal that the CIA conducted an extensive investigation into Japanese wartime weapons programs, trying to determine whether materials from those programs had been successfully evacuated, and if so, where they'd ended up. The investigation found evidence of at least 16 Cherry Blossom flights conducted between August 10th and August 14th, 1945, each transporting what Japanese records cryptically described as special materials. Flight 7 was one of only 3 flights that never reached their destinations. The other 2 had crashed due to mechanical failures. The remaining 13 flights had successfully delivered their cargoes to various remote locations. Allied investigators spent years tracking down those cargoes. Most turned out to be relatively mundane: military documents, financial records, personal effects of high-ranking officers. But 3 of the flights had carried materials from weapons research facilities, and the full accounting of what those materials included remained uncertain. The Japanese government's refusal to provide detailed information was frustrating to investigators and remains a source of controversy. Official Japanese statements maintained that all weapons research programs had been terminated and all materials destroyed before surrender, but evidence suggested otherwise. Documents showed that Operation Cherry Blossom had been specifically designed to preserve certain research programs by evacuating materials beyond Allied reach. What made Flight 7 particularly significant was its cargo manifest, or rather, the lack of one. Unlike most other Cherry Blossom flights, Flight 7 had no detailed manifest in captured records. The paperwork simply noted special research materials from Osaka facility without specifying what those materials were, how much they weighed, or where they were being transported. The absence of documentation suggested either extraordinary security around the cargo or deliberate destruction of records after the flight was lost. Either way, it indicated that whatever Flight 7 had been carrying was considered more sensitive than the materials on other evacuation flights. In 1952, I was contacted by a Japanese journalist researching the end of the war. He'd discovered references to Flight 7 in partially declassified documents and wanted to interview me about the engagement. We met in San Francisco, and his questions revealed that he knew more about the operation than I did. "Captain Morrison, do you know what you destroyed that night?" he asked, his English careful and precise. 7 Betty bombers carrying unknown cargo. That's all I've ever known. The cargo was from Unit 731. I felt my stomach drop. Unit 731 was the notorious Japanese biological weapons research program in Manchuria, a program that had conducted horrific human experiments and developed some of the most dangerous biological agents of the war. If Flight 7 had been carrying materials from Unit 731, "How do you know this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've spoken with former Unit 731 personnel. In the chaos of the surrender, some of them talked about evacuation operations. One mentioned that biological samples and research data were being flown out of Japan in mid-August. He specifically mentioned the Osaka facility as a staging point. Why would Unit 731 materials be staged in Osaka? The unit operated in Manchuria. After the Soviet Union entered the war in August 1945, Unit 731 had to evacuate rapidly. Materials were flown to various locations in Japan for safekeeping or further evacuation. Osaka was one of several staging points. Flight 7 was apparently carrying materials that were being moved from Osaka to a more secure location, possibly one of the remote islands where Japan hoped to continue research after the war. Do you have proof of this? Only testimony from former personnel, most of whom have since died or refused to speak further. The Japanese government denies everything. But the evidence suggests that Flight 7 was carrying biological research materials, samples, cultures, possibly even weaponized agents that were supposed to be hidden before Allied occupation. If this was true, the implications were terrifying. Hyde shot down aircraft carrying some of the most dangerous biological materials ever created, sending them to the bottom of the Pacific, where they could have contaminated the ocean, affected marine life, or potentially been recovered by parties unknown. But it might also mean I'd prevented those materials from being hidden successfully, from potentially being used again or falling into the wrong hands. The ambiguity was maddening. The journalist published his article in a Japanese magazine, but it received little attention in the West. The claims were explosive, but the evidence was circumstantial, based on testimony from former Unit 731 personnel who had their own reasons to obscure the truth. The Japanese government dismissed the article as speculation, and no official investigation followed. Over the decades, more fragments of information emerged. Declassified Soviet documents from the 1990s revealed that Soviet intelligence had been aware of Japanese evacuation operations in August 1945 and had attempted to track them. A Soviet report mentioned intercepting intelligence about flights transporting special weapons materials from Japan in mid-August, but the Soviets hadn't been able to intercept the flights or determine their destinations. American intelligence documents declassified in the 2000s showed that the Navy had conducted multiple expeditions to the crash site of Flight 7 between 1947 and 1963, each time attempting to recover cargo containers from the wreckage. The results of these expeditions remained classified, but the fact that they continued for 16 years suggested that something significant was believed to be on the ocean floor. One particularly revealing document, partially declassified in 2008, described a 1951 Navy diving operation that recovered 3 intact containers from the wreckage. The containers were transported to a secure facility for analysis, and the report noted that they contained biological materials of significant concern, but provided no further details. The containers themselves and any materials recovered from them remain classified to this day. I'm now 98 years old, one of the last surviving P-61 pilots from World War II. The engagement that night over the Pacific lasted only 80 minutes, 20 minutes of hunting, 60 minutes of combat and pursuit, but its consequences have lasted 8 decades and remain unresolved. I've been asked countless times over the years whether I regret shooting down Flight 7. The answer is complicated. I was following orders, engaging enemy aircraft in a war zone, doing exactly what I'd been trained to do. From a military perspective, I accomplished my mission perfectly. 7 enemy bombers destroyed, 1 escaped. But the uncertainty about what those bombers were carrying has haunted me. If they were transporting biological weapons that could have threatened civilian populations, I prevented a potential catastrophe. If they were carrying research data that could have led to proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, I eliminated a dangerous source of knowledge. But if, as the Japanese government claims, they were simply carrying administrative materials and I destroyed 7 aircraft and killed 70 men for nothing, then it was a tragedy without purpose in the final days of a war that was already won. The Japanese government has never provided a full accounting of what Flight 7 was carrying. Officially, they maintain that the cargo was routine administrative materials of no special significance. Unofficially, former Japanese officials have suggested that full disclosure would be embarrassing or potentially legally problematic given post-war agreements about weapons programs. The truth remains classified, hidden, or lost, The wreckage sits on the Pacific floor, gradually degrading, its secrets locked away by depth, time, and government classification. Whatever special research materials were aboard those bombers that night, most are gone now, destroyed in the crashes, dissolved in salt water, scattered across the ocean floor beyond recovery. But the question remains, what exactly did I destroy that night? What was so important that Japan risked 8 valuable aircraft and their crews 3 days after Nagasaki? What were they trying to hide or preserve that justified such a dangerous mission? I'll probably never know the full answer. The Japanese government won't tell. The American government classified whatever they learned. The ocean keeps its secrets. And the 80 minutes that night in August 1945 remain one of the small mysteries of World War II, significant enough to generate decades of investigation and speculation, but obscure enough to remain unsolved. One P-61 night hunt triggered an 80-minute disaster that Japan never fully explained. 7 bombers destroyed, unknown cargo lost, 70 men dead, and a mystery that has outlived most of the people who were there that night. Whatever the truth, I know this. I did my duty as I understood it at the time. The rest, the questions about cargo, the speculation about weapons programs, the investigations and cover-ups, that's for historians and governments to sort out. I was just a night fighter pilot doing my job, and sometimes in war you don't get to know the full significance of what you've done until decades later, if ever.